Thank you so very much. I promise I will not sing. So welcome. How's everybody doing today? Excellent. So we're here to talk about perfect color in Lightroom. Anybody ever have frustrations getting a print that matches what you see on your monitor display, or feels that you don't have a good eye for color? I'm going to share with you some tips and tricks to help you get the best results possible for your photos when it comes to color in particular inside of Lightroom. And we're going to go through first some, I guess you might say, conceptual. You got some homework to do if you want to actually have accurate color inside of Lightroom. And first and foremost, please, you must calibrate your monitor display. And as far as I'm concerned, the only way that you can calibrate your monitor display is with a package that includes a colorimeter. That is what this picture is showing you. In this case, the X-Rite Color Monkey display, which is a great package for calibrating your displays. There are a variety of other options available as well. And they combine this colorimeter, which is this rather sophisticated electronic device that you put in front of your monitor display, and through the software, it will project colors and tonal values on your display. The colorimeter reads those values, and based on what it reads, it's able to create a profile so that it can compensate for the behavior of your display. Now, admittedly, I'm feeling pretty confident at this point that no one is using one of those old-fashioned CRT displays. And admittedly, LCD displays and their various variations on those are quite stable. And in terms of color, they're actually pretty accurate right out of the box. However, right out of the box, most of them are about a full stop too bright. They're about twice as bright as they ought to be. And so as part of the process of calibrating and profiling your display, you're actually going to go through a process of adjusting that brightness so that you're looking at a more appropriate display, because that display on your computer's monitor is how you're making decisions about adjusting the photo. So let's simulate a little example here. I'm going to go into the develop module. Now, we're totally faking the experience here in terms of simulating monitor calibration, but I want to give you a sense of why monitor calibration is so important. So looking at this photo, for example, you can see that clearly there is a problem with the color. We have a very strong magenta cast for this image. And so, for example, I could apply some color corrections. Let's shift that magenta balance over more toward a greenish value to compensate for the magenta, and fine-tune the temperature. I'll talk more about temperature and tint a little bit later. But the point is that I want to try to get that color to be as accurate as I possibly can. So let's assume that where I've got the color now is pretty accurate. Well, that's all well and good, except my evaluation of the color in this photo was based on a, presumably, theoretically, for our purposes, a non-calibrated display. So what I'm seeing on the display is inaccurate, and therefore I'm making adjustments based on inaccurate information. And so, in fact, if I scroll down over here, you'll see that I actually had applied some split toning, simulating inaccurate color based on, presumably, a bad monitor display, an uncalibrated display. So then when I calibrate my display, when I correct my display so that it's actually showing me accurate information, suddenly the image doesn't look very good. We'll see another example of that a little bit later. But the idea is, I want to have faith in what I'm seeing on my display so that all of the adjustments, all of the decisions I'm making about that photo in terms of tonal adjustments, contrast, color adjustments, saturation, all of those various adjustments are based on an accurate view of the image. If I don't have an accurate preview of my image, all bets are off. Then when I print the image, I have no idea what it's going to look like. When I share the image online, it's not going to look very good, etc. So be sure that you've calibrated your display. I also highly recommend, maybe I don't insist in this case, but I highly recommend shooting in RAW, in large part because it gives you greater flexibility in your workflow. So I've got an illustrative example here. You see that photographic image under the title there. Some of you can maybe barely see that that is, in fact, a picture of an airplane. Not a good picture of an airplane, mind you, but it is an airplane. So I was down in San Diego, there was a military base nearby, and I see this airplane approaching. I'm fascinated by airplanes, love flying, and so of course I need to look up in the sky and see what kind of airplane this is. I see it, it's some sort of cargo plane. I have no idea what it is. I've never seen this airplane before, so I have to take some pictures. So admittedly, These are not artistic photos that I want to share with anyone, but an interesting thing happened through no fault of my own, I might hasten to add. This was my first photo, and then this was my second photo, and this was my third photo. And if you look at these two photos, there's the second shot and the third shot, you can see that the exposure was different. And what happened somehow, I don't really know how this happened, but as I'm panning across the sky, taking several pictures in sequence, suddenly the sun enters the frame, and I guess the camera wasn't able to adjust its metering fast enough. Maybe I accidentally hit the exposure lock button on the camera. I don't know, but this is the image that I ended up with. Not a very good exposure, but it was a raw capture, and look at this. Oh my goodness, can you believe it? There actually is information there. At first glance, it looks like there is absolutely nothing. It was several stops overexposed, and yet because it's a raw capture, I can actually pull some of that information back into the photo and reveal the information that looked like it had been lost. Now, of course, that's all well and good when it comes to exposure issues, but what's, I think, more interesting to me personally is taking advantage of raw capture when it comes to color issues. So, for example, I have a photograph of some tulips here. Now, in this case, I'm simulating the color effect by having multiple copies of the same image. In other words, instead of actually taking the picture multiple times, I just created multiple copies of the same source file and adjusted the white balance preset inside of Lightroom so that we can simulate what would have happened if I had used the wrong preset in the camera. But the white balance setting in the camera does not affect your raw capture. It's not actually true. Except the only thing that it affects, the color setting, the color temperature setting in your camera only affects the metadata related to white balance for that image. It does not alter the capture data itself. So it doesn't matter what you have your color temperature set to in the camera if you're shooting raw. Well, doesn't matter. What I really mean is that you have total flexibility to fine-tune things after the fact with no penalty in terms of image quality. Naturally, if there's a mismatch in terms of the color in various photos, now you have a little bit more work to do. So it can be efficient, it can be convenient to have your color temperature set in camera as accurately as possible. But when you're shooting raw, you don't really have to worry about it. So here, for example, is the photo captured with a white balance set to the daylight preset. Here you can kind of barely see the difference. So going back, there's daylight, and here's cloudy. And then we go to shade, and we get a little bit warmer. Then I change the setting to tungsten, and I get a wildly bizarre color rendition for the photo. And similarly, if I use the fluorescent preset, I get a similar result. And so if I had set my camera to any of those white balance presets, that shows you what the color would have looked like in the original capture. But if I'm shooting raw, it doesn't matter. So I can, for example, select all of those images. I'll turn on automatic synchronization, and then I'm just going to set the white balance to auto, and you'll see that all of the images update to exactly the same result. Now, bear in mind that when I choose auto inside of Lightroom, that means I'm asking Lightroom to analyze the color in the photo and to apply a color adjustment based on what Lightroom thinks the colors ought to be. That's not the same as auto in the camera. They're spelled the same, but somebody else is making the decision. Inside of Lightroom, Lightroom is making the decision about that automatic white balance adjustment. In your camera, if you set the camera's white balance to auto, the camera is making the decision. And I would say, generally speaking, your camera is probably going to be a little bit more accurate in terms of those calculations, but your mileage may vary. So again, we can adjust white balance after the capture if we're shooting in RAW, and that gives us much more flexibility, which I think is tremendously helpful. I also think it is tremendously helpful to actually understand color. And I think this is a subject that a lot of photographers tend not to focus too much energy really understanding. In fairness, color is pretty complicated stuff when it really comes down to it. I mean, you got to get like physicists involved and all sorts of things. So we don't have to dive too deeply, but we want to at least understand color as it relates to how color is reproduced for our photographic images and how it is that we can adjust the colors in our photos. So, for example, what are the primary colors? Red, green, and blue, they say. Maybe.
Yellow.
Or not.
Red, yellow,
Red, yellow, blue, said someone who is either a painter or a kindergarten teacher or something like that. What about cyan, magenta, yellow? No love for printers? Cyan, magenta, yellow, also primary colors. What do we mean when we say primary colors? And for crying out loud, what are the real primary colors? No such thing. It's however we choose to define primary colors. So when we're talking about a monitor display or a digital projector, generally speaking, almost without exception, you'll find that the primary colors for that device are red, green, and blue. And in general, we use red, green, and blue as our primary colors for emitted light. Not always, but mostly. And for printing, reflected light, our subtractive primary colors are cyan, magenta, and yellow. But there's all sorts of ways that we can define color, and there's different primaries that we can use, as you'll see shortly. I'm going to go ahead and send this image over into Photoshop. This happens to be a layered image, so we've got 3 circles, circles of light, mind you. And so I've got red, green, and blue, my primary colors for emitted light. So for example, the light you see on your monitor display. And so I have red light and green light and blue light. And what happens when we mix the lights? Red and green makes yellow, yes? And so we can mix the light, and this is exactly how colors are presented on, for example, a digital projector. Varying degrees or intensities of red, green, and blue light being shined in specific areas. And if we overlap all 3 colors at maximum intensity, then we get white. So the absence of light equals black, and the presence of all 3 of those primary colors at full intensity gives us white. Of course, even black and white don't have very clear definitions for our purposes here, because by definition, in this case, black would be, for a projector, for example, the darkest value that the projector is able to present on a screen, which is not as dark as what you can get with, for example, a monitor display, because there's going to be some leftover light, so to speak, some resilient leftover light that's being essentially bled out into other areas. So we're not going to get a pure black with a projector. Let's take a look at the primaries for ink, essentially. So I'm going to send this photo over into Photoshop as well. So we've got cyan, magenta, and yellow. Of course, you're probably familiar with cyan, magenta, yellow, and black as being our primary colors, but technically, cyan, magenta, and yellow is really all we need. So if we mix cyan and magenta and then add some yellow, if we do that at maximum intensity, we end up with black. That's in theory. Go talk to somebody who actually puts ink to paper, and they will tell you that that's a very different story. Mix the 3 colors, the 3 primaries, cyan, magenta, and yellow, at full strength, and you've got a soggy mess on your hands that's going to be more brownish than really a true black, thus the reason that we add black ink to that mix. And really it's just that our inks are not as pure as we might like them to be. But again, those are primary colors. We call them the subtractive colors because that is what we're using for printing purposes, where the light is being reflected. And so these colors, the pigments, are absorbing some but not all of the light that strikes them, and so they're putting back out into the world certain colors. And the key thing to keep in mind there is that we have 2 different primaries when we're evaluating our images under 2 different circumstances. That plays a pretty critical role in terms of evaluating our final results, as we'll talk a little bit later. But we're using one color model for the image when we're working on it on our monitor's display, and a different color model when we're printing the image. But of course, that's just by necessity. We're also seeing emitted light coming out from our monitor display versus being dependent upon reflected light for our print, as we'll see a little later. So the color wheel is sort of one way to get a sense of the relationships between colors and to maybe better understand a little bit what we're talking about when we discuss color balance and color temperature. And so, for example, most of us, I suspect, are most familiar with RGB as our primary colors and RGB values for adjusting color values for our images. So when you go into color balance, for example, you're adjusting the balance for red, green, and blue. But balance implies more than one value, right? Sort of like a teeter-totter being perfectly in balance versus being shifted. So when we're talking about red, green, and blue as our additive primaries, each of those has an opposite color. So the additive primaries and the subtractive primaries are opposites. So red and cyan are opposites of each other. Green and magenta are opposites of each other. And blue and yellow are opposites of each other. And so when we're applying a color balance adjustment, we're actually shifting all of the colors in the image toward or away from a particular color, making the image a little more yellow and a little less blue, for example, or a little more green versus cyan. Of course, we don't have to use red, green, blue, and cyan, magenta, yellow as our primaries. That's the most common primaries that we use for additive versus subtractive colors. But it's actually not based on the way the human visual system works. And so a closer representation of human vision would be the lab color model. And as it turns out, when we're adjusting color temperature in most applications, including Lightroom, we're using essentially the lab color model. L stands for lightness or luminance, how bright is a particular value. And A and B are our color channels. So you've seen the temperature and tint sliders, which we'll look at a little bit later. We're able to shift temperature between blue and yellow and the tint between green and magenta. So those become our primaries of sorts when it comes to adjusting our images inside of Lightroom. But if we're using that color model, what are we really doing to the image? Well, we don't need to use a particular color model in order to adjust the colors in the photo. And I'm going to show you several different ways that we can apply adjustments to color in the photo, each of which happen to be using different color models. It doesn't matter which color model you use, sort of, except that if you're using a color model that doesn't seem intuitive or doesn't seem to make sense to you personally, you're probably not going to be able to apply adjustments as comfortably inside of Lightroom. And so as I'm talking about the various adjustments inside of Lightroom, I would encourage you to think about what makes the most sense for you personally based on your experience, and you might want to focus on specific adjustments based on that. So for example, if I'm adjusting the temperature, I'm shifting colors toward more bluish values or toward more yellowish values. I'm not simply or exclusively affecting the blue and yellow values in the photo. I'm affecting all colors in the photo. I'm just shifting to one color or another. So I'm making everything a little more green, everything a little more magenta when I'm shifting the tint value, for example. So all of these sorts of color adjustments, by and large, are going to affect, with certain exceptions, are going to affect the entire image, which means we're adjusting all of the colors. We're just shifting every single color toward a more, fill in the blank here, value, to more yellow, to more blue, to more green, to more magenta. If you prefer an RGB model, I'll show you how we can apply adjustments via RGB as well. Of course, then the question is, how do I make a decision about how the colors should look? What defines accuracy when it comes to color in the image? Well, it depends in large part on what type of photography you're doing. If you label yourself a fine art photographer, you can do whatever you want to the color and nobody can argue with you about it. Because it's art, man. If you're a product photographer, you better get that color really, really accurate, because when somebody buys a product based on a photo they saw online, and then they get that product and the color is wildly different from what they saw, they're going to return that product and they're probably not going to be very happy. And so it does vary a little bit. Also, there's this excuse that I like to use, creative license. Like, I thought it was a little more golden hour, but I overslept. So we're just going to shift it a little bit more in post-processing. So one of the key concepts that I think is very important in terms of defining what you can get away with and what's actually accurate is a concept of memory colors. And memory colors essentially are just colors that we intuitively know the correct value for. Now, this will vary tremendously based on your own personal experience, cultural differences, etc. But for example, I suspect most of you are familiar with the shade of green that represents an unripe banana. And you're probably very familiar with the shade of yellow that represents a ripe banana, and the shade of brown that represents a super duper overripe banana. Most people have seen bananas at various stages of ripeness, and so you know what those colors look like. And so you could do a reasonably good job of identifying when the color is accurate versus not so accurate. We'll see this chart a little bit later. This is actually the Photodisc target image. Photodisc International, PDI. This was a stock agency a long time ago. And this image they essentially made public domain so that you could evaluate the accuracy of what you were seeing on your monitor and in your printed images, etc. So you look at this sample image and we have people of various ethnicities. We have some sort of everyday objects. There's a couple of fruits. It looks like a lemon and an apple. There's a sunflower. There's some colored blocks. There's the color target image up there, a grayscale wedge. So we have these various values, various objects that most of us have had some degree of experience seeing in the real world. And so you could look at this image and know right away whether or not the color was accurate. If I said, here is the image as I have optimized it, and I try to convince you that this is actually totally accurate, this is what everything really looked like under pure white lighting conditions, all of you, I hope, would know that the color is not accurate. There's far too much magenta here. And so if you're having a hard time working with color and trying to find accurate color, I would encourage you to find the PDI target image, for example, Photodisc International target image, or a similar target that has some objects that consist of memory colors so that you can apply adjustments there and develop a better eye. Because I promise you, you really can develop a better eye for color if you work with images where there are memory colors involved. And of course, it also underscores the point, if you're trying to trick everyone into thinking that the lighting was much different, just be sure to photograph stuff that nobody has ever seen before, and then they won't know the colors are inaccurate. So let's take a look at the adjustments that we might actually use to apply color corrections to the photo. And I'm going to show you a few different approaches that you might find helpful depending on how you think about color and what makes the most sense for you personally. We're going to start off with what I consider to be the most basic approach, and that is the temperature and tint sliders, which again come back to that lab color model. So we're going to be using a shift between blue and yellow and green and magenta. Now, we have several ways to go about this, and I have an opinion on this, much like I have an opinion about just about everything. Generally speaking, I prefer to just go directly to the individual sliders. So you see I have temperature and tint here. I'm inside the Develop module in Lightroom. I'm over on the right panel, and in the basic section, I have temperature and tint. Well, we already saw earlier that I had changed the preset, the white balance preset for those tulip images. I could just come to the pop-up here and say, well, this image was captured under daylight conditions, so just adjust based on daylight lighting, compensate for daylight lighting. Or I seem to recall that it was illuminated by fluorescent lights. Okay, obviously not in this case. So I could choose a preset, and that will get me, hopefully, reasonably close in terms of the overall color for the image. I can also use the eyedropper, so I can click this cute little eyedropper icon right here next to our white balance controls, and then I can come into the image, and I can click on a color value that I think should be perfectly neutral. So if I think that that yellow should be a perfect shade of gray, then I'm going to shift the image wildly toward blue because blue is the opposite of yellow. Okay, so that was obviously not the right pixel to click on. How about back here in the water? No, that's a little too yellow. Well, naturally, if I find an area of the boat here, it's obviously painted white. Maybe it's a little bit dingy, but I think that should be neutral. Here's the thing, though. For me personally, more often than not, if something is perfectly neutral, in the real world, under perfectly white lighting conditions, that object is gray, I do not want it to be gray in my picture. That's why I set the alarm clock and got up early for early morning light. Or I made a point of going out for late afternoon light during golden hour when a white object or a gray object is not going to look white or gray. It's going to have a little bit of a golden tint to it, thus golden hour. So I find that the eyedropper for me personally is not usually all that helpful because even if I found exactly the right pixel to click on, I don't want that pixel to be perfectly neutral because I chose specific lighting conditions, or I overslept and now I want to trick everyone into thinking that I got up early enough for that golden light. So here's my thinking when it comes to these color temperature adjustments. Regardless of whether I use the preset, that pop-up, or if I use the eyedropper to select a color in the image, I'm still going to want to fine-tune the values for the sliders themselves, the temperature slider and the tint slider. And so from my perspective, I might as well just start there. So I go right to temperature. Temperature is our balance between yellow and blue. So the most amazing sunrise you've ever seen versus a moonlit night. And if you feel that you don't have a good eye for color, if you look at the color and you're not sure which direction you're supposed to go, I think one of the best things you can do is to make wild swings with these sliders. So take that temperature slider all the way to its maximum value, and then all the way to its minimum value. In most, but not all cases, in most cases, those extremes are going to produce results that are clearly wrong. So then you start going back and forth, and you start kind of keeping your movements a little more toward the accurate range, so to speak, the range that seems to be pretty accurate. And over time, you'll actually start to develop a better understanding of color. You'll see more clearly, you'll understand more clearly how different color shifts affect different actual colors in the photo, and you'll start to develop a better eye for when it is accurate versus not. Of course, if you're like me, sometimes you can't quite get the mouse to do exactly what you want it to do. And so in those situations, I will click at the numeric value. So over to the right of the temperature slider, you can see whenever I'm changing the value, I'm actually creating a numeric value. In this case, it's degrees Kelvin. It's a compensation factor. And so I can change that numeric value first by clicking on it to make it active, to highlight it, and then using the arrow keys on the keyboard. And the same trick works for all of the numeric text boxes, the numeric fields inside of Lightroom. It can be very, very helpful. So I'll start off holding the Shift key and then using the up arrow to increase the value or the down arrow to decrease the value. And by holding the Shift key, I'm getting a stronger effect. It's applying a bigger adjustment. When I'm dealing with whole numbers, it's a 10x factor. So up and down arrow increases or decreases by 1, and adding the shift increases or decreases by 10. With color temperature, the scale is a bit different, but the same concept applies. And so I can fine tune that color using shift up and down arrows to take big adjustment steps. And then once I think I'm pretty close, then I can just use the up and down arrows to continue fine tuning the color. In this case, I think I'll warm things up just a little bit, make it a little bit more yellow than a perfect neutral value might have otherwise been. Then I can move on to my tint slider. And tint, as we've already seen, allows you to shift between green and magenta. Now, I know a lot of photographers who like to shift an image toward a cooler value. Think of a snow scene with lots of shadows, and the shadows are going to have a bluish look to them. Or a very yellow value, a golden look, a warmer tone. When it comes to tint, though, we're not usually after a green or magenta interpretation of our photo. And so our adjustment for tint is usually going to be quite a bit more subtle. And almost without exception, that means I'm going to want to make use of that arrow key trick on the keyboard. So I can once again click into the numeric field for tint and shift up arrow to increase the value in big increments, shift down arrow to decrease in big increments, and then once I get to the point where I'm pretty close, maybe right about there looks pretty close, I can let go of that shift key and continue fine-tuning the color with just the up and down arrow keys all by themselves. So again, those exaggerated swings can really help you get a better sense. This is wrong, that's wrong, and somewhere in between is going to more clearly be shown as accurate. You'll be able to get a better evaluation of that value in terms of being accurate. Of course, there are other ways that we can adjust the color in our photos, and we'll take a look at some of those shortly. But first, I want to take a look at what are arguably my favorite controls in terms of adjusting color, and that is vibrance and saturation. Because every image needs stronger colors, right? Especially if it's HDR. Then we just max out the saturation setting and call it good. No, not really. But vibrance and saturation, these allow us to adjust the intensity of colors, or perhaps more accurately, the purity of the color. So how do you take yellow and make it more dingy? You add other colors to the mix. If it's absolutely pure yellow with no other colors being added whatsoever, then you know that you have a highly saturated yellow. So when we're adjusting saturation, we're actually adjusting color purity. So we could make the colors so impure that we now have a grayscale image if we reduce saturation all the way. If we take that saturation value all the way up, then we can have some very strong colors. Sometimes, well, most of the time, increasing saturation all the way is going to create rather silly colors in the image. But what I like is the vibrance adjustment because it's got a little bit of built-in self-control. So if I increase the value for vibrance, what I'm really doing is having a stronger effect on the colors that are not very saturated than I am on the colors that are already saturated. So you can see here, for example, that the sky is getting a much bigger adjustment. It's having much more impact in terms of increasing the saturation with vibrance than is happening for the yellow flowers, the field of canola down below. And that's because the yellow is already very saturated, whereas the blue in the sky is not very saturated. So I think of the vibrance adjustment in many ways as a saturation equalizer. I'm bringing the colors that are not very saturated up closer to the intensity, to the purity of the colors that were already saturated. And in many cases, what I'll actually do is increase that value so that the colors have about the same saturation. So the sky is about as saturated as the flowers in the foreground, for example. Of course, by the time I've gotten the sky to match the yellow in terms of saturation, now the overall saturation of the image is probably a little bit too strong. And so then, after I've equalized the color saturation with vibrance, then I might actually reduce the overall saturation in the image with a negative value for saturation. So just kind of fine-tuning that intensity of color. In the process, I am not changing the actual color or the hues within the image. I'm only changing the intensity of those colors, the saturation. So both vibrance and saturation are allowing me to adjust the overall perceived saturation of those colors. Because vibrance has got some self-control built into it, it actually protects skin tones, for example, so it's great if you're working with portraits. The vibrance adjustment is my go-to adjustment when it comes to saturation, and I treat the actual saturation slider as a secondary control for that purpose. So if you happen to be an RGB person, meaning you're familiar with red, green, blue, you're familiar with the color balance adjustment. For those of you who've been working in Photoshop for a while, you know that your primary color correction is generally going to be a color balance control where you're shifting, for example, between red and cyan. If you prefer that color model, it is still available inside of Lightroom. It is just hiding from you. So temperature and tint, that's that lab color model where we're shifting between blue and yellow as well as green and magenta. If we scroll down to the tone curve, this is what gives us the ability to apply a color balance adjustment using the RGB model. Wait, color? But it says tone curve. Yes, they just labeled it wrong. It is a tone curve, but we can adjust the tone of each individual color channel. And when you adjust the tone of each individual color channel, you're actually adjusting the color. Let's take a look. Under tone curve, again on the right panel in the develop module, I have a channel here, RGB, red, green, blue. So by default, I'm adjusting the overall tonality of the image. But I can choose red or green or blue. And so if I decide that I need to shift the red versus cyan balance in the image, I can choose the red channel. Now I'm adjusting the tonality of the red channel, but by doing that, I'm actually adding red by brightening that channel, or adding cyan, subtracting red, by darkening that channel. And even better, I can actually, for example, add red to the shadows and subtract red from the highlights. So in this case, obviously, making the image look like it was really badly processed film or something. But you can see that I'm able to have a different effect in terms of color balance at different tonal values within the image, which can be tremendously helpful. We could, for example, warm up the shadows and cool down the highlights to get a better balance in the overall photo. So the tone curve not only allows you to sort of think in that RGB color model, So here's red versus cyan. I can switch to green and shift between green and magenta. And I can switch to the blue channel and shift between blue and yellow. So I'm able to think in terms of that RGB color model, if that's what's more comfortable for me, if it's what I'm more accustomed to, but also I'm able to apply varying degrees of adjustment for each of those 3 color channels based on luminance values in the photo. So again, adjusting the shadows different from the highlights, etc. So that gives me the ability to apply some rather sophisticated adjustments for the photo. I can also use the HSL controls. Let me hide the histogram here so that we can see more of these adjustment controls. And you'll see that we have the HSL versus color versus black and white. Now if I choose the black and white, or B and W, then I'm actually able to convert the image to black and white, and I can adjust the luminance values based on the underlying color values in the photo, which is tremendously helpful. But of course, today we're here to talk about color, not black and white. So I'll want to focus my attention on either HSL, which stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. How do I remember that? I don't have to. It's right there on the right panel. You can see we have a set of controls for hue, a set of controls for saturation, and a set of controls for luminance. We can also look at the individual hue sliders, saturation sliders, or luminance sliders all by themselves, but I prefer the all option because it allows me to work a little bit more fluidly, and also if anybody happens to be looking over my shoulder, it is way more impressive to have lots and lots of sliders displayed. I can also go to the color option. It is literally exactly the same sliders. They're just grouped differently. I don't really know why we needed both options, HSL plus color, but we have them all. So we can use the HSL to get the hues all together, the saturations all together, and the luminances all together. Or we can go to color, and hue, saturation, and luminance is displayed for the reds, and then hue, saturation, and luminance for the oranges, etc. So it's just how the controls are grouped together. If you have a preference, that's wonderful. My preference is HSL. And so I like to adjust these. Usually I'm thinking about the hues first, then the saturations. Luminance I don't mess with too much. But I can actually shift the colors of the colors. So think of this as a color balance adjustment for a specific range of colors at any given moment. So I can change the definition of green, for example, to make it more like artificial golf course green versus more brownish yellow green. So you see those greens being changed down below in the foreground, or well, I guess that'd be the background behind the plane here, but down on the ground, on the landscape itself, I can fine tune the color balance for the greens. Or the color, the very definition of yellow itself. I can make the yellows a little more kind of orangey or a little more kind of yellow-green-ish. In this case, what I might actually do is shift the sky a little bit, get those aquas and blues toward a little bit more of a cobalt blue as opposed to a kind of cyan blue if I want to get that sky looking a little bit more interesting. Making that even better, I can come down to the saturation controls. So not only can I shift the color values for individual colors within the photo, but I can, for example, take those blues and make them way more saturated. That's looking much more realistic, isn't it? Or desaturate. So I can fine tune the overall colors. So I'm taking individual colors and fine-tuning their appearance, shifting the hue, the actual base color value, which again you can sort of think of as a color balance adjustment for a specific color, the saturation, which is that intensity or purity of the color, and then luminance. Now with luminance you do have to be a little bit careful. Luminance is sort of like adding white paint or adding black paint to your colors, and you probably don't ever spill paint on your photographic prints. The luminance adjustments, if you apply too strong an adjustment for luminance, the colors can start to look a little bit weird relatively quickly. That doesn't mean that you can't touch those luminance sliders, that you shouldn't use them at all. It just means that use a little bit of caution. Pay careful attention to the actual color values within the photo if you're applying adjustments to those luminance values. But I find in most cases, when I feel that an individual color, maybe the yellows weren't quite as good as they should be, they didn't look quite accurate, most of the image looks pretty good. So I will make sure that I have fine-tuned the overall color for the image first, then come and adjust individual colors that didn't look quite as good as they should. So maybe I want those yellows to be a little bit more intense, and maybe shift them. They were looking a little too kind of orangey. I want to make them a little more pure yellow, etc. Again, making that evaluation on my calibrated display so that all these very careful color decisions I'm making are based on an accurate review of the photos, which is why you don't probably want to use a projector unless you've created a profile for the projector to actually evaluate the color, and it's why you might see different results on different projectors or different displays, etc. But all that really matters in terms of adjusting my image is what I'm seeing on my actual calibrated display. Now, in some cases, I'll actually take those targeted adjustment capabilities and really start to nitpick in the image and look for what I call problem colors within the photo. So areas of the image where the color doesn't look quite accurate, or it's distracting, or I just don't care for it. And so in this case, for example, I know some of you have seen this image before. We have up at the top corner of the image, in the background there, and there's a fairly common issue with landscape photography where we've got haze causing atmospheric scatter. The light is being scattered in terms of the color values. And so we get odd color effects back in the background. And here, for example, I'll just go ahead and increase the overall saturation. And you can see that I have quite a bit of kind of a purplish magenta look in that background. Now, obviously, this is the desert Southwest. They don't call this area red rock for nothing, right? And so we've got those orange and red and yellow tones in the rock, but to me, that kind of pinkish tone in the background is a little bit distracting. And so I'd like to get rid of it. Well, I can use those HSL adjustments for exactly that purpose. I'll crank up the saturation values for, in this case, purple and magenta. And yes, I actually want to reduce the values, not increase the values. But before I reduce the values using these controls, I will increase the value as a way of validating that I'm applying my adjustment to the correct color in the correct area of the image, etc. So for example, zooming back out and making sure, evaluating that image and making sure that the only area being affected by my adjustment is the area that I'm actually trying to apply my adjustment to. Now, obviously, in some cases, I might need to use a targeted adjustment, maybe use the adjustment brush to paint an adjustment into a specific area of the photo. But by and large, I find that in many cases, if there's a problematic color, I can resolve that problematic color using these HSL controls. So again, I like to apply the opposite of the adjustment I'm actually after, increase the saturation for those colors to get a better sense of, have I chosen the right color value? Am I applying the adjustment in the correct area? Are there any problems being created? And then once I've confirmed that, I can reduce the value. Now, if I take those values all the way down to -100, you'll see that I've reduced saturation so much that I basically have gray rocks in the background. I don't want that. I just want to tone down what I considered the problem colors to be. And so I'll try to find a nice balance where I'm toning down the color without creating any new problems for myself. I think that works pretty well. I'll turn off those HSL adjustments. In fact, there's the before and there's the after. So I can use the little toggle switch here. It's like a light switch, which is available for most of the sections. In fact, all of the sections except the basic section here on the right panel in the Develop module. And I can flip that switch downward to turn off that set of adjustments, flip it upward to turn it back on, and so I can see that before and after very clearly. Of course, sometimes, as I mentioned previously, I need to apply a more targeted adjustment, not based on color values per se, but rather based on what I call geography within the image, the specific area of the photo itself. And so in that type of situation, I need to use a different approach. I want similar adjustments or access to similar adjustments, but I want to apply them in a targeted way. And that's where our gradient filter, our radial filter, and our adjustment brush come into play. Now, to make it really easy on myself, I've chosen an image that has a very simple area that I want to apply an adjustment to. I can get very sophisticated and use the adjustment brush to paint, to define the adjustment into very specific areas of the photo. In this case, I really just want to correct this background area, and so I'm going to use the gradient filter. And what I like to do when I'm working with the gradient adjustment, I'll go ahead and reset all of these controls, and I'll put all of them except exposure back to a neutral value. I'll use an exaggerated adjustment so I can better see where I'm affecting the image, in other words, where I'm defining that gradient. And then once I'm pretty happy with that, then I'll go back and refine my controls. So I've chosen that gradient filter. I've set my, in this case, exposure. This is what I typically apply, is just a full minus exposure. -4 stops, exposure compensation, but defining that adjustment based on a gradient shape within the image. So then I just simply click and drag within the image. The point where I initially click determines where the transition begins. I can then drag and move my mouse around to define the shape of that gradient. Wherever I release the mouse is where the transition will end. I can also hold the Shift key to constrain, to lock that to, in this case, a perfectly vertical gradient. Now, of course, if I didn't get the gradient quite perfect, no problem, because it remains fully editable. You'll see that I've added this button, as it were, onto the image. I can click and drag right on that button to move my gradient around within the image. I can click on the top or bottom bar in order to change the size of that transition for the gradient. And I can click on that central line in order to rotate the gradient. Little tip for you, I strongly recommend that if you're going to rotate your gradient, move your mouse way out, as far away from that button as you possibly can, so that a small movement equals a small movement. If you bring your mouse way in here, you're going to find yourself flipping that thing around like crazy. So bring your mouse way out toward the edge, and then you can make small movements in order to make small adjustments. So let's assume that that's a pretty good position for my gradient. Obviously, it's not a good adjustment. What I want to do here is actually to correct the overall color. So I've got a lot of haze off in the background. I might want to cool off the color there, so shift it away from yellow toward more of a blue value so that the haze in the background is not looking quite so dingy. Of course, I might also just want to apply a dehaze adjustment, which I can apply as a targeted adjustment. So I can cut back on that perceived haze. I can shift the color a little bit as needed. In this case, reducing the saturation as well. Don't want to go too far because it'll start to look too gray. Now I've got fog instead of haze in the background if I go to a grayer value. But you can see that I'm able to adjust the overall color appearance. I don't want it to be too blue because that also starts to look a little bit odd. And so shifting maybe to somewhere right around there. Just in this case, warming it up primarily because dehaze has a tendency to pull out any blue values from the shadows in the image. And so something along those lines. Obviously, I can continue fine-tuning this set of adjustments. I could fine-tune the position of the gradient itself in the image. But there we go from haze to, okay, it's still a little bit too blue, so we'll shift that, maybe reduce saturation a little more. But you get the idea. I'm able to apply that targeted adjustment to fine-tune specific areas based on color. So I've got the temperature and tint, I've got saturation, and of course some of these other adjustment controls will also have an impact. Alrighty. So once you've spent lots and lots of time making your images look absolutely perfect. You've already calibrated your display, so you have confidence that what you're seeing is an accurate reflection of the image. You spent lots of time practicing applying your adjustments, maybe using images with memory colors so you can help hone your skills when it comes to applying those color adjustments. And then you have an image that you're happy with, and you want to share it with someone else. Well, how are we going to go about sharing that image with someone else? There's several ways, and for our purposes, of course, the most important thing is to try to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that the color will remain as accurate as possible. Now, there's actually essentially just one trick that you need to know in this regard, and that is sRGB. So inside of Lightroom, Lightroom is using a color space that is essentially ProPhoto RGB. It is a huge color gamut. Any color you can imagine is probably included inside of ProPhoto RGB. Of course, your monitor can't display that full gamut, you can't print that full gamut, but you can adjust images to include all the colors included in ProPhoto RGB inside of Lightroom. The problem is that not everybody else in the world is color managing their workflow, is calibrating their monitor display. Now this actually creates a little bit of a conundrum, because we can make sure that our colors are absolutely perfectly accurate, and we can share them in a way that's going to make sure that there is accurate color information inside the file. But if the person who's viewing your image is not using color management, did not calibrate their display, suddenly all bets are off. And so there's some argument for applying adjustments to your images to intentionally darken your photos by about one stop before you share them online because everybody else's monitor is about a stop too bright. Personally, I'd rather make sure that the color and the tonality are accurate, and if somebody's not getting a good result, that means they should calibrate their displays or they should turn down the luminance on their display. You could argue both sides of that, and no matter what, there's going to be a problem with somebody. But I'd rather make sure that my images are going to look as accurate as possible for those who are actually employing color management, because those, I feel, are the people who are most likely making decisions about paying me for my images versus someone who's not calibrated their display. But let's take a look. I'm going to use the export option in this case, and we'll go ahead and define our settings. So first of all, I would choose what type of file I'm going to be creating. Well, if I'm sending the photo to someone else or posting the photo online, more often than not, I'm going to create a JPEG image, essentially trying to balance file size with overall image quality. If I were sending the image to be printed, then I would export a TIFF image in most cases, and I would ask the person who is doing the printing, what color space would you like me to use? And then I would adjust my settings when I'm exporting accordingly. So we're using this exporting for sharing online as our example, maybe sending via email. So I'm going to create a JPEG. Quality, generally speaking, if I'm posting it online, I might set the value to about 80%, essentially balancing file size with image quality. If I'm not concerned about file size for some reason, then naturally I would just set that to its full maximum value. But for a website or a blog, I would typically use a value of 80%. Color space. So this is where we're able to define the color space that we want to use for the image. Why is sRGB everyone's answer for online sharing? Well, there's actually two reasons. Well, it's one reason with two kind of twists to it. sRGB, generally speaking, is closest to the typical native color space of most monitor displays. Most monitors can display sRGB with no problem, the full range of colors that are included in sRGB. A few monitors, a relatively small percentage of monitors, although an increasing number, are capable of presenting the entirety or nearly the entirety of the Adobe RGB color space. So we used to think of Adobe RGB as a color space for printing, sRGB as a color space for the monitor. Some monitors are actually capable of presenting all of the Adobe RGB color space. Then we have ProPhoto RGB, which is incredibly huge. No monitor can present all of the color values included inside of ProPhoto RGB. In fact, I'm going to go on record with a prediction. I predict that there will never, ever be a monitor that is capable of displaying the entirety of the ProPhoto RGB color space. There will never be a device in the known universe capable of presenting ProPhoto RGB, because the mathematics of ProPhoto RGB actually mean that there are colors that are simply imaginary, numerically impossible, not part of the visible spectrum. So ProPhoto RGB would really be just for sending an image for archival purposes or to a printer who requests it, etc. But just bear in mind that we're sort of applying adjustments to an image when it's possible to create colors that we can't even see, which can be kind of interesting. So for sharing online, sRGB, again, it's closest to what most monitor displays are capable of. Also, and I might call this the real reason that I convert to sRGB for online sharing, in the absence of color management, because sRGB is pretty close to what most displays natively present, in the absence of color management, ProPhoto RGB will give you a bad result, sRGB will generally give you a very good result. Maybe not 100% accurate, but it's going to be your closest to accurate. So if someone is viewing your image in a web browser that does not support color management, or a web browser where color management is turned off by default, which is probably the majority of people's web browsers today still, then sRGB is going to help make sure the colors appear as accurately as they possibly can. So we can also adjust the file size, etc. And so I can adjust all the various other settings. I can apply some sharpening, maybe for the screen at a low amount, etc. I can add a watermark if I want to put, my website address or what have you. But most importantly, in terms of color, is that conversion to sRGB. Again, for online sharing, if you're sending the file to be printed, check with the printer and find out what they recommend. But then we can export that file. In this case, I'm just saving that file out to a folder on my desktop. And so now, that folder contains a JPEG version of my image that has been converted into the sRGB color space. And so I can post this online, put it on my blog, whatever the case might be, and I can feel reasonably confident that the color will be accurate. Reasonably confident. Not supremely confident, but reasonably confident. I should hasten to add, by the way, if you're using the publish services inside of Lightroom, so for example, Facebook, if you take a look at the settings, you'll notice that under file settings, you don't even have the option for that color space. So preferably, I want to make sure to use the sRGB color space anytime I'm sharing images online. Preferably, I also want my copyright metadata to be included, but Facebook decides for itself how it's going to deal with your files, including removing your copyright information from metadata. I'm sure only for purposes of reducing the file size, not for creating orphan works. All right. What about printing? Printing gets a little trickier. So once again, when we're looking at an image on our monitor display, we're seeing emitted light. When we print that image, now we're depending upon reflected light. It is a very different experience looking at a print versus looking at a monitor display. Someday, we're going to have prints that will literally glow with light, and they'll be just as luminous as our monitor displays. I'm sure of it. But until then, we're dependent upon reflected light. So one of the complaints that I hear most often from photographers is that they made a print and it is too dark. And do you know what I tell them when they say this? Turn on the lights. Because you're working, I hope, in a relatively darkened environment so that the ambient light is not influencing your perception of what you're seeing on your monitor display. And then you make a print, and in the dark, you evaluate this print, and it looks too dark. Whereas you put it out into the light, and suddenly we can see a lot more information down in those shadows. That said, it's still very common that you'll have shadow detail lacking or seeming to be lacking in your prints. And that's because most printers, even with a really good profile, are not capable of producing a full range of tonal values. They can't give us all of the shadow detail that we're able to see on our monitor displays, for example. So what to do? Fortunately, Lightroom gives us some relatively basic adjustments, relatively simple and easy to use adjustments in the print module. So after I make a print and I decide it's too dark, after I've looked at that print under a nice bright light source, then down at the bottom of the right panel in the print module. Now obviously, I can pick and choose which specific settings, what size print I'm producing, what size paper I'm printing to, the sharpening settings, etc. We'll take a look at some of those other options in terms of color in a moment. But more importantly for our purposes at the moment is the ability to turn on the print adjustment option. So I can adjust the overall brightness and contrast for the print. I can increase or decrease the brightness, and I can increase the contrast. So if the print looks too dark, especially when it comes to shadow detail, I can come down to the bottom of the right panel, turn on that print adjustment checkbox, and then increase the value for brightness. The problem here, as you can see, I'm changing the value for that brightness slider, and you see absolutely no change whatsoever in the preview image that we're using to evaluate our slider value. Thank you for nothing. Well, I mean, not nothing, because the slider's there. I just have no sense of how strong an adjustment I actually need. Unfortunately, this is going to be a trial and error adjustment. So I would recommend increasing, but somewhere around 15 or 20, typically I find works pretty well. make another print, see if that was a good enough adjustment or whether you need to take it up or down from there, make another print, make another print, make another print. Now, as much as that might be mildly frustrating that we've got to make multiple prints through trial and error to try to figure out what the best adjustment is, when you've identified an appropriate adjustment for a single printer, ink, and paper combination, that adjustment should work pretty well across the board for most, if not all, of your prints. So, printer, ink, and paper combination, that's several variables. Yes, but probably you're using a single printer most of the time. Many photographers are using literally just one printer, not multiple different printers for different prints. So that might be just one printer. Ink set, that's just the ink that you use in that printer, which is probably the inks from the printer manufacturer, so that variable is not going to change too much for most of us. And then for when it comes to paper, I find most photographers tend to settle on a handful, maybe 2 or 3 or so of their favorite papers. And so you might need a different print adjustment for different papers, but by and large, once you've established those basic settings that work for a given print condition, it's going to work pretty consistently. So it seems like a lot of trouble, but once you've done the initial trial and error work, you're probably not going to need to do too much in the way of adjustment, changing that adjustment in the future. Well, that's tonality. What about color? Well, color's a little bit more tricky. And very often, when a photographer gets a print and they're not happy with the color, my first question, hopefully you can anticipate what my first question would be when they say my print is not accurate. I'm going to ask them if they've calibrated their monitor display, because if they didn't, they chose to have an inaccurate print. So if you want accurate prints, your first step is to calibrate the display, as we said way at the beginning of this presentation. Then you need to make sure that you're applying accurate adjustments to produce the best image you possibly can. Then we have to consider that printing workflow. Once again, that target image, an image that has memory colors, can be very helpful for troubleshooting. But more importantly, is understanding the inherent limitations of the print process. So let's take this image, for example, a relatively saturated subject. And let's consider what's going to happen when I try to print this image. I can anticipate my disappointment, because when it comes to highly saturated colors, it's very difficult for a printer to be able to reproduce those values. The inks need to be really, really well saturated in the first place. I'm going to turn on the soft proofing checkbox on the toolbar down below the image, not in the print module, but in the develop module. That might seem like a funny place to simulate printed output, but it's actually a very good place to simulate printed output, because then if you're not happy with what you see, you have some degree of control in terms of applying adjustments inside of the develop module. So I'm going to start by turning on that soft proofing checkbox on the toolbar down below my image in the develop module. Notice that the image changed just a little bit, you might have noticed already, and I now have a white background rather than that gray background. Actually, that's not white. I mean, it is, sort of, but it's not necessarily white. That's paper color. And so if you have a profile for a paper that has kind of a creamy tone to it, you'll see a more creamy background there as well. So it's trying to simulate, Lightroom is trying to simulate as best it can what that final print is going to look like. Well, what settings are we actually going to use for that soft proofing display? If I expand my histogram up here, you can see that's changed to soft proofing, and I have settings related to the soft proof. So let's go ahead and choose a different profile. How about matte paper? Whoa. Never mind. Let's print it on glossy paper. Glossy papers, by and large, are going to give you more saturated colors, because glossy papers make sure that the ink stays way up close to the surface of the paper so that it doesn't bleed into the other colors and otherwise get reduced in terms of saturation. Now, some matte papers are actually coated matte papers. They'll have a special coating that is intended to keep those inks from absorbing too far into the paper in order to keep that saturation level up. But I can preview. I can actually get a sense of which paper I might want to use for a given image based on the soft proofing display, seeing the differences, the changes between matte paper versus glossy paper. And you can see with a matte paper, I'm not going to end up with as much saturation in the image. I'll turn off soft proofing. There's my original color. And there's what I think the print is going to look like based on the profile that I've selected for matte paper. Well, how do I choose a profile? Obviously, I can click the pop-up here and choose a particular profile, but I can also click the other option from that pop-up and see a list of all of the profiles that are installed on my computer, all of the output profiles that are installed on my computer. And so, for example, maybe I want to take a look at the velvet fine art paper, etc. So I've got a variety of profiles that I can choose from. Those that have a check mark next to them are the profiles that will actually appear on this pop-up list. And so, for example, I just added velvet so we can see a preview of what the image would look like there versus premium luster. Notice the change in the background color, that white changing to more of a white for the glossy paper, for example, as compared to the velvet where it's a little bit more yellowish. I can also choose the rendering intent, perceptual versus relative. Well, this relates to the colors that are out of gamut. In other words, the colors that the printer is not capable of reproducing. Let's see which colors this printer is not capable of reproducing. All of the colors that have the bright red over them right now, the printer cannot reproduce. That's just about every color in this photo. And so printing this image is going to be a particular challenge. Right now I'm looking at the matte paper. Obviously we would expect lower saturation for matte paper. So I've enabled that preview, that gamut warning for the output after I've enabled soft proofing, and then by clicking that sheet of paper icon at the top right of the histogram, that will put a red overlay on the image showing me areas of the photo that include colors that my printer cannot print. Well, now what? There are several things I could do. I could just accept it. I could print to a matte paper just knowing that a print to a matte paper is usually going to be less saturated than a print to a glossy paper. I could change my mind about the paper. Well, instead of a matte paper, let's go with a glossy paper. Now what's out of gamut? Not very much. You can see up here at the top of the balloon, this yellow area, you get a little bit of red there and some red inside the balloon. The yellow areas there are out of gamut. There's a few random areas, but it's mostly the yellows. I can toggle that option, that preview, off and on. You'll see that a little bit of this red area next to the basket is also out of gamut. It's a little difficult to see the red overlay on top of a red area of the photo. So I wish it was, some neutral gray or something, that overlay. In any event, I can see which areas of the photo cannot be printed. So with glossy paper, I'll get a pretty good result. There'll be some colors that are outside of the capabilities of the printer, ink, and paper combination that I'm using, but it's going to be a lot better than if I use a matte paper where a lot of the colors are simply not reproducible. So let's go with glossy. That seems to make a lot more sense. Then we can choose our rendering intent. So again, rendering intent relates to how Lightroom should deal with colors that the printer can't reproduce. It's got to do something with them. So what will it do? What perceptual does is takes the entire image and reduces the overall saturation until all of the colors are within the capabilities of your printer, ink, and paper combination. The benefit to perceptual is that the relative relationships between colors, the relative differences between colors, get maintained. The problem is the overall saturation of the image reduces. With the relative, it's actually relative colorimetric rendering intent, colors that are in gamut, colors that the printer is able to reproduce, they're not changed at all. Only colors that are outside of the color gamut get shifted to the closest matching color. So generally speaking, I find that I prefer the results with the relative colorimetric rendering intent, but you can switch back and forth and see if there's anything significant in terms of the change in that preview. So if I turn off the clipping preview, that out of gamut warning, and go back to the matte paper profile and switch between relative versus perceptual, you can see that we've got a little bit of a difference, but generally speaking, the relative colorimetric option is the one I prefer because generally speaking, it's going to retain as much saturation as possible. The only time that I would use perceptual, for me personally, generally speaking, is if the colors in the image, if there are certain colors in the image that are wildly out of gamut, and most of the other colors are not out of gamut, because in that situation, the perceptual rendering intent is going to shrink the saturation for everything. So again, generally speaking, I find that I prefer the relative colorimetric option, but there might be a few situations where perceptual works better. And this will vary by printer and by the paper that you're using. Your decision might vary on certain images, one image to the next. So it's worth taking a look at the preview, but just understanding that relationship, that behavior of each of the rendering intents, I would say that generally the relative colorimetric rendering intent is going to produce the best results. Not always, but as a general rule, it is my preferred option. Okay, so now let's just assume that we want to print to matte paper for whatever reason, and I don't like the preview. It looked better before I turned on that checkbox. Yes, but this is simulating what that paper is going to do to your image, that printer ink and paper combination. Okay, fine, you say. If that's the way it's going to be, I'm going to come down to my saturation control, and I'm going to increase the saturation of the image. Well, first off, Lightroom says, wait, hold on a second. You're applying an adjustment based on the print. Do you really want to apply an adjustment to your master image that is based specifically on printing to a particular printer with a particular ink set to a particular type of paper? Wouldn't you rather make a virtual copy, or in this case, it calls it a soft proof copy? Wouldn't you rather make a proof copy so that the adjustments specific to this printed output are separate from your master image? Because the adjustments will be different for different types of paper, etc. So yes, Lightroom, thank you for letting me know about that, for reminding me. I will click the Create Proof Copy button. Notice that I could have clicked that option from the onset underneath the soft proofing controls. So now I have my original image. I'll turn off soft proofing for that one. I have my original image that I can now use as the basis for any other output, but when I'm printing to this particular matte paper that I've specified, notice how it's oversaturated until I turn on soft proofing, and now it gets moved back down. But here's the thing. Increasing saturation inside of Lightroom doesn't somehow magically make my printer capable of producing more saturated colors. So really, I'm probably not going to have much of an effect on that final print, at least in terms of the saturation of those colors. For example, I'll turn on the preview that warns me. Now, I've increased the saturation. Yay! I fooled Lightroom, and I've made all the colors more saturated. Great! Now even more colors in the photo cannot be printed with the printer ink and paper combination that I've selected. So I'm not really fooling anyone. But what I might do is try to find some adjustments that will enable me to get a better result. Now, if I want to make sure that every single color in my image can be printed accurately, I can just take the perceptual rendering intent approach and desaturate my photo until all of the colors are in gamut. That's essentially the perceptual rendering intent. Reducing saturation until everything's in gamut, but again, the problem is now it's not as saturated as it could be. I've sacrificed some of the colors that could have been more saturated, so that underscores that preference, my preference toward the relative colorimetric rendering intent. But I might also, remember our HSL controls? I might also try to shift the colors a little bit. So I can find other colors that will work better. So for example, well, looky there. If I shift the sky to make it green, now my printer can reproduce those colors. See how easy that was. So once again, I have successfully tricked Lightroom into producing a print where not yet all, but theoretically all of the colors are in gamut. I also will have a print where the sky is green rather than blue. So I need to be careful here and not try to outsmart the limitations of my printer, but I might actually want to shift the values. If I come over a little bit more toward a kind of cyan aqua sort of appearance, and then maybe try to increase the saturation for those colors just a little bit, I might be able to find a value that works pretty well for this image in terms of printing to that particular output condition. But here's the thing. Remember what relative colorimetric is doing as a rendering intent. Colors that the printer is capable of printing get left alone. The colors that are beyond the capabilities of your printer are shifted to the closest matching color. So quite frankly, most of the time, just by printing with good settings in terms of a good profile, etc., I don't have to worry about what's going on in the background, and I don't have to worry about trying to make adjustments to the image. Under normal circumstances, with a good printer profile and with a good choice of paper that's going to produce a good result for the image, I don't really need to apply any adjustments with a soft proof copy or a virtual copy, because I know that essentially the software, Lightroom and my print driver, etc., they're all going to be working together to produce the best print possible. So a lot of this really just comes down to understanding the limitations of different output conditions, and that soft proofing can be very helpful, number one, in understanding those limitations, but also making choices. Oh, for this image, probably do not want to consider matte paper, unless I'm just not that concerned about the saturated colors in this case. So what happens when the print doesn't match? Well, first off, let's take a look at the actual print settings. We've actually essentially already looked at the print settings, because soft proofing, remember, is simulating the final print on our monitor display. And so when we're configuring soft proofing, we're actually configuring our print. So we essentially already know how to do that. We'll go into the print module, and then down at the bottom of the print module, you'll see that I have a color management section inside of the print job section, and that is where we can specify who is in charge. And as a general rule, I want Lightroom to be in charge, essentially, or more to the point, I want an ICC profile to be in charge. That profile defines the behavior of a specific printer with a specific ink set to a specific paper. So if you are using a paper that is manufactured by your printer's manufacturer, the same manufacturer, then you probably already have profiles for that paper built into your printer drivers. They get installed automatically, and so they'll be available here. If you're using third-party papers, you can go to their website, and in most cases, they will provide profiles that in most cases are pretty accurate and support the most popular printers. If you don't see the profile for the paper that you're using, the printer ink and paper combination that you're using or that you want to use, maybe you've just downloaded a new profile and copied it into your profiles folder, you can, once again, as we saw in the soft proofing section, choose that other option and go find the profile that we need to use for our specific output conditions, turn on the checkbox for it, and then click OK, and that will be available. So instead of letting the printer do all of this, the interpretation of our color information, I'm going to use a specific profile. A profile for the printer ink and paper combination I want to print to. We already decided after looking at that soft proof that we are not printing this image to a matte paper, so I'll choose a profile for the glossy paper, for example, that I want to print to. I'll change that rendering intent as appropriate, again, usually relative. Those are the same settings that I was using when I was soft proofing, because I was simulating the printed output. Now I'm setting those same settings here. Obviously, I also need to adjust all of the other settings in terms of the page size, etc., etc. But at this point then, I can print the image, and I use the printer option here so that it will bring up my printer dialog, and then I can change the various settings for that printer. And most importantly, I want to make sure that I have disabled color management in my printer with my printer drivers. Now for Macintosh users, that's generally handled automatically. For Windows users, you'll have an option. So you can see here it says off, no color management, and that is the option. Again, it's disabled here because it was done automatically on my behalf by the operating system. But if that option is available, I want to make sure to disable color management in the printer driver, in the print settings, because I don't want what is referred to as double color management. Lightroom is saying, well, I need to apply a compensation to make up for the behavior of the printer, so I'm going to change the color information that I'm sending to the printer, and then the printer says, well, I need to apply a change in the color values to make up for the behavior of the printer, and now we've got a double adjustment that is not going to produce an accurate result. So make sure that if you're using an ICC profile, if we've chosen a specific profile inside of Lightroom for printing, we want to make sure that we're disabling color management for the printer. If for any reason you want to manage color by the printer using the printer driver itself, then obviously you will enable color management in your print driver. Generally speaking, the only time that I recommend this approach, with certain print drivers, they have improved controls inside the print driver for black and white printing, and that will often produce a better perfectly neutral black and white print or a grayscale print rather than using a profile that's really intended for a color print. But otherwise, if you have a custom profile available, I strongly encourage you to use that. Of course, you want to make sure it's an accurate profile. So what happens when the profile doesn't seem to be accurate? You make a print, you know that you established all those settings perfectly, and the print doesn't look right. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is go check to make sure that those settings that I know I set accurately are really set accurately. Did I choose the correct profile for the printer, ink, and paper combination that I was printing to? I'm then going to run a nozzle check if I'm printing to an inkjet printer, because very often what you think is an inaccurate print was theoretically an accurate print. It's just that a clogged nozzle caused one or maybe a couple of the colors to not actually make it onto the paper. And so if there's no magenta ink being laid down as part of that print, things are going to shift toward green. Your image is going to look very green in print, but really it's the absence of magenta ink that created that effect. So check for clogged nozzles, for example. Once you've gotten beyond that, we already know that you calibrated your monitor display so that what you're seeing is accurate, but then I would actually use a reference image. That same, in my case, I use the PDI target image. There's a variety of other sample target images out there that you could use so that you can evaluate. So bring this image up on your computer and see, is that seeming to be accurate? On my monitor, does this look accurate? Yes? Okay, let's go look at that print again. Let's print this image with the exact same printer settings that you know are accurate, and now how does that print look like? By using a reference image like this, you're able to get a better sense, essentially, of who to blame. Is it your monitor that's inaccurate, or is it the printer that's inaccurate? And then, of course, you have to figure out what specifically is the issue there. Is it a clogged nozzle? Is the profile no good, etc.? So some trial and error might be necessary, but usually by evaluating an image like this, you'll be able to relatively quickly figure out what's going on and who to blame, essentially. And by that, of course, figure out then what you need to change. Do you need to recalibrate your display? Do you need to get your vision tested? Do you need to use a different printer or unclog the nozzles, get a different profile, whatever the case may be. So maybe you try printing to a different type of paper, for example. You get the idea. You go through various steps to kind of troubleshoot and identify the source of the problem so that you can then resolve the issue based on that. But again, most of this comes down to a few things, really. Number one, calibrating your monitor display, understanding color, practicing actually, to make sure that you're applying really accurate adjustments to the image, and then using a proper workflow when you're sharing that image, whether it's through printing or sharing online, etc., to help ensure that you're going to have the most accurate, the most predictable, and consistent results for your color possible. So with that, thank you very much. I hope that's been helpful. It's been loads of fun.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.